I always believed that a mother's love shouldn't need to prove itself with money or luxury. My son was the center of my world. The reason I woke up every morning and the reason I worked myself to exhaustion every night. He thought he knew everything about me, that I was just a simple, small town woman who spent her life working ordinary jobs and saving every penny. What he didn't know was that behind my modest clothes and quiet smile was a woman who had built an empire in silence. I never told him about the small real estate company I started 20 years ago after his father passed away. I never told him that the woman who took the bus to work every morning actually owned the building she was walking into. To him, I was just mom, ordinary, plain, unremarkable. And honestly, I preferred it that way. But sometimes pretending to be smaller than you are becomes a habit so deep that even the people you love forget to look beyond what they see. It all began the day my son, Daniel, called me with a tone that felt different. His voice was polite but distant, as though he was speaking to a stranger he needed something from. "Mom," he said carefully, "Lauren's parents are visiting from New York this weekend. We'd love to have dinner together. They want to meet you." His words sounded normal enough, but the hesitation between them carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I had met Lauren only twice since their wedding, both times briefly, both times in situations where she seemed more interested in checking her phone than in speaking to me. She came from wealth, old wealth, the kind that wore expensive perfume and smiled without warmth. Her parents, from what Daniel had told me, were even more refined. The kind of people who measured others not by heart, but by status. Still, I said yes. I had no reason to decline. But the moment I hung up, I felt a strange ache in my stomach. Not fear, but a quiet sadness. Something in Daniel's tone wasn't right. It wasn't the excited voice of a son who wanted to introduce his mother proudly. It was the careful, anxious tone of someone trying to prevent embarrassment. I sat in my small but comfortable living room, surrounded by furniture I'd chosen decades ago. Nothing fancy, just familiar. The old clock ticked softly on the wall as I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling. But the thought kept circling in my mind. Was my son ashamed of me? That question burned quietly in the back of my mind for days. I tried to focus on work, on my employees, on meetings and numbers, the things that normally gave me peace. But no matter how busy I became, the thought of that dinner haunted me. I'd spent years teaching my son about kindness, empathy, and humility. I raised him to value people, not possessions. But maybe in his new world, the one filled with luxury cars, designer clothes, and charity galas, those lessons had faded into background noise. Maybe my simple way of living was something he now found embarrassing. So I decided to do something that even surprised me. I would go to that dinner, but not as the successful woman I truly was. I would go as the version of me they assumed existed, the poor, naive, small-town woman who spent her life working ordinary jobs and saving every penny. What he didn't know was that behind my modest clothes and quiet smile was a woman who had built an empire in silence. I never told him about the small real estate company I started 20 years ago after his father passed away. I never told him that the woman who took the bus to work every morning actually owned the building she was walking into. To him, I was just mom, ordinary, plain, unremarkable. And honestly, I preferred it that way. But sometimes pretending to be smaller than you are becomes a habit so deep that even the people you love forget to look beyond what they see. That night, as I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I thought about the years that had shaped me. The sleepless nights after Daniel's father died, when I held my crying child close while working late into the night on financial reports. The afternoons I spent fixing leaky roofs, renting out rooms, saving every penny. No one ever saw those struggles, and I never needed them to. But now, the silence I once wore like armor suddenly felt heavy. Because if my own son couldn't see the strength behind my simplicity, what was the point of everything I'd built? I took out an old box from the closet that held photos from the past. Daniel in his school uniform, holding the lunchbox I used to pack for him, our tiny apartment with peeling paint but filled with laughter, the first office I ever rented when my business finally took off. Each image reminded me of the woman I once was, strong, determined, full of hope. And as I looked at them, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let anyone make me feel small again, not even my sons in laws. The night before the dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between my hands. I replayed Daniel's voice in my mind. "Please dress nicely, Mom. They're very particular." I smiled sadly. It was a simple sentence, but it spoke volumes. He wasn't worried about me being comfortable. He was worried about how I'd look. That realization hurt more than I expected. Still, I wouldn't confront him. Not yet. I needed to see for myself how deep this embarrassment ran. Outside, rain began to fall softly, tapping against the window like a quiet warning. I turned off the lights and stood in the dark for a long moment, watching the reflections of passing cars shimmer across the wet pavement. In that silence, I decided exactly what I'd do. I would wear my oldest dress, the one with faded floral prints that I used to wear to Daniel's school events years ago. I would tie my hair the way I did back when we couldn't afford salon visits. I would become the mother they expected to see. Humble, plain, forgettable. But behind that disguise, I would be watching. Every gesture, every glance, every polite smile that didn't reach their eyes. Because sometimes the only way to see people's true colors is to let them think you're colorless. And deep down, I already knew. This dinner wasn't just about meeting my son's in-laws. It was about rediscovering the truth about him, about them, and maybe even about myself. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, as if the sky itself knew what kind of day it would be. I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had the courage to rise. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the clock. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the worn-out slippers by my feet. For a long moment, I didn't move. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision I was about to carry out. Pretending to be someone else was one thing. Pretending to be less than you are was another entirely. But this wasn't about pride. It was about revelation. Sometimes you have to dim your own light to see who still sees you in the dark. I opened the old wooden wardrobe that had been with me since my first apartment. Inside, clothes hung neatly, organized by season, by memory. On one side, tailored suits, silk blouses, and dresses I wore to board meetings or business galas, each one a symbol of a chapter I'd written quietly while the world underestimated me. But on the other side, hidden beneath hangers and folded sweaters, were relics of my past, the clothes from when life was still a struggle. My fingers brushed over them until I found what I was looking for. A pale lavender dress, faded at the seams and soft from too many washes. I had worn it the day Daniel graduated from high school. I remember standing in the crowd, tears in my eyes, waving at him while everyone else's parents wore suits and pearls. That day, I promised myself that no matter what it took, he would never have to live through the struggles I did. I took the dress out and held it up against the light. It looked small now, fragile, like a memory that had survived too long. But it would do. I laid it on the bed and began to assemble the rest of the disguise. A pair of old black flats with scuffed toes, a plain cut-and scarf, a canvas handbag that had once carried grocery lists and unpaid bills. I tied my hair into a simple bun and looked into the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the confident business owner who'd negotiated million-dollar contracts. She wasn't the woman who owned 3 rental buildings across the city. She was someone else. The mother who stood in supermarket lines counting coins, who patched her son's school uniform so he could look neat among richer classmates. And yet, seeing her again made my throat tighten. That woman in the mirror had been through hell and never once asked for help. She had built everything with calloused hands and sleepless nights. I touched the mirror gently, as if greeting an old friend. "Let's do this," I whispered. I skipped breakfast. My stomach was too tight for food. Instead, I made tea, sipping it slowly as rain tapped faintly against the window. Every sound in the house seemed louder, the rustle of curtains, the creak of the floorboards, as though time itself was holding its breath. I thought about calling Daniel, about telling him I couldn't make it. But no, this was something I had to face. I needed to know if his love for me had changed, if it had conditions. When it was time to leave, I grabbed my small purse and stepped out into the wet morning air. The city was waking up, people hurrying to work, children splashing through puddles, buses groaning down crowded streets. I called a cab and gave the address Daniel had texted me, La Fontaine, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. I'd heard of it before. It was the kind of place people posted about, not because of the food, but because of the statement it made. I almost laughed at the irony. Years ago, I had been one of the early investors in the restaurant group that owned La Fontaine. I'd helped them open their first branch when they were struggling. But Daniel didn't know that, of course. To him, I was just Mom. The cab ride felt endless. As we drove through the city, I watched expensive cars glide past, their tinted windows reflecting the world they didn't want to see. For a moment, I felt a pang of doubt. Was I really doing the right thing? What if Daniel truly loved me and this experiment hurt him unnecessarily? But then I remembered his tone, polite, cautious, almost apologetic, and I knew I had to go through with it. When the cab finally turned onto the avenue where La Fontaine stood, I caught my breath. The building shimmered under the rain, all glass and gold, with ivy climbing its front columns, and a doorman in a crisp black suit holding an umbrella for arriving guests. Through the wide windows, I could see chandeliers sparkling like captured stars. Couples in designer clothes laughed softly as waiters glided by with wine bottles that probably cost more than my entire outfit. I paid the driver, stepped out, and stood under the awning for a moment. The rain had stopped, but the air was cool and smelled faintly of roses and pavement. I could feel eyes on me already. Subtle, curious, judgmental. A middle-aged woman in a red dress glanced at me briefly before whispering something to her partner. I ignored it. I'd seen that look too many times before. The silent measurement, the quick dismissal. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and walked through the door. The warmth of the restaurant hit me instantly, thick with perfume and the scent of truffle butter. My shoes squeaked slightly on the marble floor. The hostess, a young woman in a black dress, looked at me with a polite but uncertain smile. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you have a reservation? I gave her my son's name. She checked the list and nodded quickly, her expression softening into trained professionalism. Right this way, please. As I followed her through the maze of tables, I could feel the contrast between worlds. Silk dresses brushed against velvet chairs, laughter echoed in practiced tones, and soft jazz filled the spaces between conversations. And then I saw them. My son, Daniel, seated near the window, his suit immaculate, his hair perfectly styled. Beside him, Lauren looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, elegant, confident, flawless. Across from them sat an older couple, Lauren's parents radiating wealth and authority. For a split second, Daniel's eyes met mine, and I saw it. That flicker of discomfort, the tightening of his smile, the barely concealed sigh. He stood up, adjusted his cufflinks, and waved me over. "Mom, you made it," he said, his voice cheerful but strained. And in that moment, I knew tonight would change everything.
For a heartbeat, no one spoke. I stood there, rain-damp and trembling inside, though my face stayed calm. The table gleamed with silver cutlery and crystal glasses. It was long enough to seat 8, but only 5 chairs were occupied, one of them waiting for me like a spotlight. Lauren rose halfway from her seat, offering the sort of hug that ends before it begins. "You look lovely, Mrs. Hale," she said, the pause between the words doing more talking than her mouth. Her perfume was sharp, citrus and money. Behind her, her mother examined me the way a jeweler examines a fake diamond. "So nice to finally meet you," she said, her smile brittle. Her husband only nodded, glancing at my shoes as if they had spoken in offense. Daniel pulled my chair out, but not close enough to the table, so I had to shuffle forward myself. He cleared his throat. "Mom, this is Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, Lauren's parents." I smiled politely. "It's a pleasure." My voice sounded smaller than usual, deliberate. If I was going to play the role, I would play it perfectly. Mr. Whitmore adjusted his napkin with exaggerated precision. "Daniel tells us you're from Meadow Hill. Quite little town." "Yes," I said softly. "Been there most of my life." Lauren's mother, Evelyn, lifted her glass of wine. "How charming. I imagine it must be simple." The words slid out coated in honey, but stung like acid. Daniel jumped in quickly, eager to fill the silence. "Mom's always been humble," he said, laughing nervously. "She doesn't need much to be happy." I caught the tremor in his voice, the way he couldn't quite look at me. That single sentence, meant to defend, cut deeper than any insult. It told me exactly how he'd introduced me to them, not as the woman who raised him single-handedly, but as a relic from a poorer world, someone to be tolerated politely. The waiter arrived, and conversation drifted to menus and wine lists. I watched as the Whitmores discussed vintages in the same tone people use to talk about weather. When the waiter turned to me, I said gently, "Just water, please." Evelyn smiled again, this time wider. "You don't drink wine?" "I prefer to keep my head clear." She tilted her glass and took a slow sip. "How disciplined." Daniel looked mortified. "Mom, maybe you'd like to try—" "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, cutting him off kindly but firmly. The next half hour was an exercise in endurance. They talked about art auctions, holiday villas, and the dreadful economy. Every so often, one of them would toss me a question, the conversational equivalent of spared change. "So, Mrs. Hale," said Mr. Whitmore at one point, "what do you do to keep busy these days?" "Oh, little things. I manage a few properties around the city." Daniel nearly choked on his drink. "She means, her apartment complex," he said quickly, eyes darting to me, begging me not to elaborate. I only smiled. "Yes, among others." Evelyn leaned forward. "That must be quaint." Her voice had that elegant condescension people use when pretending interest in something beneath them. My pulse drummed in my ears, but outwardly I remained serene. They didn't need to know that a few properties meant 22 rental units and 3 commercial lots. They didn't need to know that the very restaurant we sat in paid monthly dividends to my company. Tonight, ignorance would be my shield. When our meals arrived, the tension thickened like the sauce on their plates. Every bite, every clink of cutlery felt rehearsed. I could see Daniel trying to juggle two worlds, the polished one he'd married into and the humble one he'd come from. But in trying to balance them, he was losing both. Halfway through dinner, Evelyn placed her hand dramatically on her pearls. Daniel, I must say, your home is exquisite. Lauren showed us pictures. Such taste. Lauren blushed modestly. Oh, thank you. We just finished redecorating. Evelyn turned to me with mocked curiosity. You must be so proud of what they've achieved. I imagine it's quite different from where you live. I took a sip of water, holding her gaze. Yes, I said quietly. Very different. My home's smaller, but it's paid for. Her smile faltered for half a second. Daniel looked down again. Lauren shifted uncomfortably. It was a small victory, but it tasted sweeter than any dessert. Then came the moment that twisted the knife. Lauren's father chuckled and said, well, success isn't for everyone, right? Some people are content with simple lives. The world needs both kinds. I laughed softly. That's true, I said, my tone calm but heavy with meaning. And sometimes the simple ones build the world the others take credit for. He blinked, unsure whether I just complimented or insulted him. The silence that followed was delicious. Even the music seemed to pause. The waiter appeared again, oblivious to the tension, offering dessert menus. Evelyn declined gracefully. She was watching her figure. Daniel looked relieved for the distraction, but I could sense the panic in him. He wanted this evening to end neatly, without conflict, without embarrassment. He didn't realize the evening had already become a mirror reflecting who they truly were and what he had become. As coffee was served, Evelyn leaned toward me again, her tone now patronizingly gentle. You know, Mrs. Hale, I remind you so much of my late housekeeper. She was such a devoted woman, always so polite, never asked for more than she had. People like you are rare these days. My chest tightened, but I forced a smile. That's quite the comparison, I said. I only hope she was treated well. Her expression stiffened. Of course, she said quickly, looking away. I could feel the tremor of humiliation under my skin, yet strangely, it didn't break me. It made me stronger. Every dismissive glance, every polite insult, was proof that my instincts were right. These people valued appearances above souls, and the son I had raised with love and sacrifice was sitting silently among them, too afraid to speak. The evening crawled toward its end. Plates were cleared, bills were requested, and laughter, thin and forced, echoed around the table. When the waiter returned with the check, he handed it to Daniel automatically. But before my son could reach for it, something unexpected happened. The waiter froze mid-motion, his eyes widening with recognition. Mrs. Hale, he said suddenly, genuine warmth flooding his voice. It's an honor to have you here again. Four heads turned toward me in confusion. Daniel's brow furrowed, Lauren's mouth parted slightly. The waiter continued, smiling. Your usual table wasn't available tonight. I'm so sorry. And thank you again for supporting our staff fund last month. It made such a difference. Evelyn blinked, clearly struggling to understand. You know each other? The waiter looked puzzled by her tone. Of course. Mrs. Hale is one of the restaurant's earliest investors. The table went silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Daniel's hand froze over the check. Lauren's father's face drained of color. Evelyn's polite smile collapsed into disbelief. And as I sat there, the woman in the faded lavender dress, I felt something rise inside me. Calm, unshakable power. The night was far from over, but the game had already changed.
For a long moment, no one moved. The clatter of other diners, the soft hum of piano music, and the hiss of the espresso machine faded into a distant blur. Every eye at our table was fixed on me, as if I had suddenly transformed into someone else, someone they didn't know, someone they had underestimated. The waiter, unaware of the bomb he had just dropped, smiled politely and excused himself to fetch another round of napkins. I folded my hands in my lap, pretending not to notice the stunned faces around me. Inside, my heart was steady, calm like still water before dawn. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never had I expected it to arrive so naturally, almost accidentally. Fate had decided to take the mask off for me. Evelyn was the first to recover. Her voice, which had moments ago been dripping with superiority, now quivered with artificial warmth. "Oh, I didn't realize you were involved with this restaurant, Mrs. Hale. How wonderful! What a coincidence!" Her husband gave a stiff laugh that sounded like it hurt. "Indeed, you must be a silent partner then. We've been coming here for years. Never knew we were dining under your management." Daniel's face was ghost white. "Mom, you invested here?" he asked, his voice low, almost trembling. I turned to him slowly, meeting his eyes. "A long time ago, before you left for college. It was one of the first businesses I put money into after selling the factory lot your father and I owned." Lauren's eyebrows shot up. "You owned a factory?" I nodded gently. "Textiles. Your husband grew up running between rolls of cotton and dye barrels. He used to hide in the storeroom to eat his lunch so he could surprise me after work." Daniel's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. His jaw flexed. Guilt painted his face like a shadow. Evelyn laughed, too high-pitched, too quick. "Well, that's quite an entrepreneurial story, isn't it?" She said, "You must be so proud, Daniel. Your mother's clearly a resourceful woman." Her attempt at charm only deepened the awkwardness. The false smiles around the table shimmered like cracked glass. The waiter returned, laying a small card beside my plate. "As always, Mrs. Hale, thank you for your continued support. We're grateful." I smiled at him kindly. "You're doing wonderful work, Michael. Keep it up." When he left again, silence thickened. Lauren's father cleared his throat. "Well, this changes everything, doesn't it?" "Does it?" I asked quietly. 4 faces turned toward me. I leaned back slightly, my tone calm, but deliberate. "Because 5 minutes ago, when you thought I was poor, it seemed to make everyone uncomfortable. Now that you think I have money, suddenly I'm interesting. I'm curious what exactly changed." Evelyn flushed. "Oh no, you misunderstand." "I don't think I do," I interrupted softly, my voice still gentle but sharp as glass. "You were very polite, polite enough to hide what you truly thought. I'm used to that." Daniel rubbed his temple, whispering, "Mom, please." But I wasn't angry, I was heartbreakingly clear. "Do you know what the saddest part is, Daniel?" I said, turning to him. "It's not that they looked down on me, it's that you let them." He froze. The words hit him like a physical blow. Lauren looked between us, confusion flickering into realization. "Daniel," she murmured, but he couldn't meet my gaze. "When your father died, I told myself I'd raise a man who'd never be ashamed of his roots, who'd never measure a person by the shine of their shoes or the label on their coat. I worked, I saved, I built something from nothing. And when you made your own life, I was proud. Until tonight." Daniel's eyes glistened. "Mom, it's not like that." I smiled faintly. "It is exactly like that. You warned me not to embarrass you. You asked me to pretend to be less than I am, to dress poorer, to act simple, so they would like me. And I did it, because I wanted to see the truth." Evelyn's lips parted in protest, but I didn't give her the chance. And now I have. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Even Lauren looked shaken, her eyes darting between her husband and her mother. Her fingers trembled as she set down her fork. "Daniel," she whispered, "is that true?" He swallowed hard. I didn't want them to misjudge her." "But they did," I said softly. "And so did you." The waiter approached again, this time with dessert menus. Unaware of the emotional wreckage scattered across the table, I waved him away gently. "No dessert for us tonight. Thank you." He nodded and left us in the silence we had earned. Lauren's father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mrs. Hale, I think you're being unfair. Surely you can see this from a parent's perspective. We only want the best for our daughter. Appearances matter in our circle. Appearances? I echoed. Funny thing about them, they're fragile, like glass, and once they crack, they can't be fixed. He didn't respond, neither did Evelyn. Lauren looked up then, her voice trembling. Mrs. Hale, I didn't mean to make you feel small. I just didn't know who you really were. I looked at her kindly. That's the point, dear. You shouldn't have to know who someone really is to treat them with respect. Her eyes lowered, shame creeping into her face. I rose slowly, placing my napkin on the table. This meal has been very enlightening, but I think it's time I go. Daniel shot up too. Mom, please, don't leave like this. I looked at him, not with anger, but with a sorrow that only a mother can feel. How else should I leave? As the simple woman you introduced me as, or as the mother who built the life that allowed you to stand where you are? He reached for my hand, but I drew it back gently. Daniel, someday you'll realize that love and pride can't live in the same heart. You chose pride tonight. Tears welled in his eyes. Evelyn fidgeted with her pearls, desperate to escape the tension she helped create. Lauren stared at the tablecloth as if it could swallow her whole. As I turned to leave, I heard Evelyn whisper, almost pleading, Mrs. Hale, we didn't mean to offend. I paused, glancing back over my shoulder. Oh, I know you didn't mean to. That's what makes it worse. And with that, I walked away from the table, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The other diners barely noticed, but for those sitting behind me, that sound might as well have been a gavel striking judgment. Outside, the rain had stopped. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of redemption. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because for the first time that evening, the truth, not appearances, had finally filled the room I left behind.
The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement, blurring into streaks of gold and red as the rain fell harder, as if the sky itself was weeping for everything that had just broken. I didn't rush. My heels clicked slowly against the stones, each step echoing through the hollow in my chest. I had imagined that walking away would feel powerful, freeing even, but instead, it felt like walking out of a memory that no longer belonged to me. Cars swept by, splashing puddles near the curb. I tightened my scarf, though the chill wasn't really from the air. It was the kind of cold that comes from disappointment, sharp and visible and deep. I kept thinking of Daniel's face when I told him the truth, that brief flash of realization, the collapse of all the little lies he had built to protect his pride. I stopped beneath an old street lamp. Its yellow glow trembled through the mist, painting my reflection on the puddles at my feet. The woman looking back at me didn't seem victorious or even angry. She looked tired, not from the years she had lived, but from the love she had given to a world that had measured her worth in appearances. I pressed a hand to my heart and whispered to no one in particular. I did what I had to. Somewhere behind me, I heard footsteps splashing against the wet road. Quick, desperate, uneven. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Daniel. Daniel's voice cracked through the rain, breathless and raw. I froze, my back still turned. He reached me within seconds, his hair drenched, his short plastered to his chest, the expensive suit now soaked and wrinkled. He looked nothing like the polished man who had sat so confidently at that restaurant table. He looked like my boy again, the one who used to run to me after falling off his bike, eyes filled with apologies and tears. Daniel, please, just listen to me, he gasped, trying to catch his breath. I didn't move. The rain slid down my face, blurring the tears I hadn't realized were falling. Daniel, go back. You'll get sick. I don't care, he said, stepping closer. His voice trembled, thick with guilt.
Mom, I'm sorry. I don't even know how to explain it. I thought I thought if they liked you, things would be easier. I thought if they saw you as what? I turned to face him, my voice breaking through the downpour. As less than you? Less than them? He flinched, his eyes wet, not just from the rain. No, it wasn't like that. I just I didn't want them to judge. They can be cruel, and I wanted to protect you from that. Protect me? I let out a bitter laugh, one that hurt to hear. From what, Daniel? From people's opinions? From a family that can't see past a dress or a handbag? He shook his head. No. From embarrassment. From being your mother, I finished for him. The words cut like glass, and for a moment, even the rain seemed to pause. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. Mom, please, don't say that. Then tell me, I said softly, my tone no longer angry but heartbreakingly gentle. When did I become a secret you needed to hide? He looked down, silent. The sound of water rushing into drains filled the empty space between us. I could see the battle behind his eyes, pride crumbling, shame rising, and love fighting to breathe again. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. I didn't realize what I was doing until tonight. When I saw how they treated you, it broke something in me. And then when that waiter recognized you, when I found out who you really are, I felt like the smallest man alive. All this time, I thought I was protecting you, but the truth is, you never needed my protection. You were the one protecting me. I looked at him, and for the first time that night, I saw the boy I'd raised, not the man the world had shaped. He took a step closer, his voice trembling. Mom, please forgive me. I don't care what they think. I don't care if Lauren's parents ever speak to me again. I just need you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. The rain slowed to a drizzle. Somewhere, a car horn echoed in the distance. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave my shoulders. Daniel, I said softly, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be kind, to remember where you came from, to remember me, not the image you think the world wants you to show. He nodded, his lips trembling. I promise. I'll make it right. Making it right isn't about apologies, I said, stepping closer and brushing a wet strand of hair from his forehead. It's about how you treat the next person who walks into your life with less than you. That's when I'll know you've truly learned. His eyes closed and he nodded slowly. I will. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain fell softly now, like a whisper between mother and son. The street lamp flickered above us, its glow painting a halo around the moment, fragile, painful, and somehow sacred. Finally, I took a deep breath. Come on, I said gently. You're drenched. Let's go home. He hesitated. Home? Yes, I said with a faint smile. Not the one you built for appearances, the one that built you. We walked in silence. The sound of our footsteps was steady this time, no longer echoing in anger, but in quiet reconciliation. I could feel him beside me, his head slightly bowed, his hands trembling with remorse. And though my heart still ached, there was a part of me that felt lighter, as if something that had been tightly wound for years had finally begun to unravel. When we reached the corner where the taxi waited, I looked up at him. Daniel? He turned. Next time you introduce me, don't tell them what I have or don't have. Tell them who I am. He nodded, his eyes glistening. Yes, Mom. And as we drove away, I looked out through the window at the passing lights, the city blurred by rain and reflection, and realized something. Sometimes love doesn't grow in comfort. It grows in confrontation, in the cracks of disappointment, in the places where truth finally breathes. That night, under the rain, My son saw the real me, and for the first time, I think he also saw himself. When we reached home, the world outside seemed to have exhaled. The rain had washed the streets clean, leaving behind a shimmering stillness, puddles reflecting pieces of the moon, air thick with that post-storm scent of wet earth and renewal. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the faint click of the lock sounding louder than it should have. Daniel followed behind me quietly, like a child entering a sacred space he'd forgotten belonged to him. The house greeted us with its familiar silence, the kind that doesn't accuse, but remembers. I set my scarf on the hook, slipped off my shoes, and moved toward the living room without turning on the lights. The soft glow from the street lamps outside filtered through the curtains, casting silver streaks across the floor. Daniel lingered by the doorway, uncertain whether to sit, speak, or simply disappear. For a few long minutes, neither of us said a word. I poured 2 cups of tea, a habit I had formed long ago when conversations grew too heavy for food. The steam curled into the air like whispers. I placed 1 cup in front of him. He didn't touch it. He just stared at the faint ripples on the surface as if searching for something he had lost. Finally, I spoke. "Do you remember this house?" He looked up, confused. "Of course I do." "No, Daniel," I said gently. "I mean, do you really remember it? The nights you used to sit on that couch, pretending to do homework while watching cartoons? The mornings I left early so you'd never see how tired I really was?" He blinked, his voice fragile. "I remember you always working, always managing everything. I didn't understand it then." I smiled faintly. "You weren't supposed to. Children aren't meant to understand sacrifice, only to feel its protection." He lowered his gaze. "And I repaid that by being ashamed of you." The honesty in his words hit like a tremor, but I didn't flinch. "You were ashamed of what you didn't understand. That's not the same." He looked up, desperate. "But it feels the same to me now. I keep seeing your face at that table, pretending not to care. And I hate myself for letting them talk to you like that." I sipped my tea slowly, letting his guilt hang in the air, not to punish him, but to let him feel its truth. I asked him quietly, "Do you know what hurt the most?" It wasn't their judgment. I've seen worse in boardrooms filled with men who thought I didn't belong. "No, Daniel. What hurt was hearing you describe me as simple, as if simplicity were something to apologize for, as if love and dignity could ever be small things." His jaw tightened, emotion flooding his face. "I didn't mean it that way. I didn't know how to make them accept you." I looked at him, my voice soft but steady. "You don't make people accept others, Daniel. You teach them by example. And tonight, you taught them and yourself something you'll never forget." He swallowed hard, his eyes glassy. "Lauren tried to stop them, but she didn't know what to say. Her parents, they've always been judgmental." "And what about her?" I asked, curious. "Was she embarrassed too?" He hesitated. "No, just silent." I nodded. "Silence speaks loudly, Daniel. Sometimes louder than cruelty." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this. I feel like I broke something between us." I studied him for a moment. the lines of worry that had formed around his eyes, the way his hands trembled when he spoke. I said softly, "You didn't break anything that can't be rebuilt, but understand this. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about seeing the truth and choosing not to let it poison you." He looked at me then, as though truly seeing me for the first time. Not the role, not the expectation, but the woman, the mother who had walked through storms, built empires, and still cooked his favorite soup when he came home sick. A tear slipped down his cheek. "You don't deserve any of this, Mom." I smiled faintly. Maybe not, but sometimes we go through humiliation not because we deserve it, but because others need to learn what grace looks like. He wiped his face, his voice trembling. "I told Lauren everything on the way here. She's coming by tomorrow. She wants to apologize too." "Good," I said, setting my cup down gently. "But tell her she doesn't owe me an apology. She owes one to herself. Because when you learn how easily you can lose dignity over appearances, you start living differently." He nodded, understanding dawning slowly. We sat there for a while, saying nothing. The clock ticked softly in the background. It struck midnight, and for some reason, I thought of all the nights I'd stayed awake when he was a baby, watching over his crib, wondering what kind of man he'd become. I'd hoped for kindness above all things. Success without compassion was just another kind of poverty. After a long silence, Daniel spoke again. "Mom, how did you do it? How did you build all this, your businesses, your life, and never tell anyone?" I looked into my cup, the tea now cold. "Because I didn't need to prove anything. The world is obsessed with showing, Daniel, showing love, showing wealth, showing happiness. But true strength, true power, doesn't shout. It doesn't need an audience. It just is." He nodded slowly, taking that in. The weight of understanding was heavy on his shoulders, but necessary. Growth always came wrapped in discomfort. Finally, I stood and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You should go rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." He looked up, eyes pleading. "Can I stay here tonight? I don't want to leave you alone." For the first time since the restaurant, I smiled fully. "You were never the one leaving me alone, Daniel. I was the one waiting for you to come back." He exhaled shakily and nodded, following me down the hallway to his old room. It still looked the same. The faded posters, the bookshelves stacked with dusty trophies, the bed too small for the man he had become. As I closed the door, I stood there for a moment, listening to the stillness settle again. The rain outside had finally stopped. The city was sleeping. And somewhere deep inside, something in me, that wounded, aching part of motherhood that had carried years of quiet sacrifice, finally began to heal. I whispered to the darkness, as if to my younger self, "You did well. You didn't break. You just bent long enough to teach them what love really looks like." And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel peace. Not the kind that comes from being understood, but the kind that comes from knowing you were right to stand in your truth, even when no one else saw it. Morning came softly, like forgiveness itself. The night's rain had polished the world into something tender. Streets glistened, leaves dripped in slow rhythm, and the golden light filtering through my curtains seemed gentler than usual. I woke before the alarm, though I hadn't really slept. My thoughts had wandered all night, weaving between the faces at that dinner table and the silent ache in my son's eyes. The house was quiet. I moved through it slowly, making tea the way I always did, with the ritualistic calm. The kettle's hiss, the faint clink of porcelain, the steam curling upward like a prayer. I wasn't angry anymore. not even hurt, just still. The kind of stillness that follows a storm when you finally accept that nothing will ever go back to what it was, and maybe that's okay. At precisely 9, I heard a hesitant knock on the door. Soft, careful, not the kind of knock that demanded entry, the kind that asked for it. When I opened the door, Lauren stood there. She looked different from the night before, stripped of her usual confidence. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes red from crying, and she clutched a small bouquet of white lilies, though her hands trembled slightly. Behind her stood no entourage, no parents, no polished smiles, just her. "Good morning," I said softly. She hesitated. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller." Then, catching herself, she quickly corrected, "I mean, Mom, if you'll still let me call you that." I stepped aside. "Come in." She entered like someone stepping into a church, careful not to disturb the silence. I gestured toward the couch and poured her a cup of tea. For a while, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy, but not hostile, more like the calm before truth finally decides to surface. "I didn't sleep," she said quietly, tracing the rim of her teacup. I kept replaying everything from last night. The things my parents said, the way Daniel just sat there, the way you... She paused, shaking her head. "You didn't even flinch. You just smiled and took it all in." I watched her closely. "And what did you learn from that, Lauren?" She looked up, her voice trembling. "That I've spent my whole life mistaking grace for weakness. I thought silence meant surrender. But last night, you showed me it's the strongest weapon a person can have." Her words surprised me, not because they were flattering, but because they came from a place of awakening, the kind that only pain can teach. I set my cup down. "Your parents come from a world where money buys manners, but not kindness. They value appearance because they've never learned to value character." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I know. I've spent years pretending not to see it. But last night, I did. I saw who they really are. And I hated that I just sat there while they judged you, the woman who raised the man I love." There was sincerity in her voice, no performance, just remorse. I sighed gently. "Lauren, life will always test you that way. People will insult others in front of you, not to hurt them, but to reveal who you are. How you respond defines you." She wiped a tear from her cheek. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to stop them, but I was afraid of making it worse. "And yet," I said softly, "sometimes silence does make it worse. It gives cruelty room to grow." Her eyes lowered, voice breaking. "I know. I failed that test." I smiled faintly. "No, my dear. You learned from it. That's what matters. Growth doesn't come wrapped in comfort. It comes dressed in mistakes." She let out a shaky breath. "After you left, there was this awful silence. My mother tried to justify everything, said she was just being honest. My father said you were probably exaggerating about your background. And Daniel, he just exploded. He told them who you really are, about your work, your companies, your charity projects, everything." I arched my eyebrow. "And how did they react?" She gave a small, humorless laugh. "They panicked. Suddenly they wanted to invite you over again, this time to make a proper impression. My father even said he'd misjudged your class. I told him he hadn't misjudged anything, he'd just revealed his own." For a brief moment, pride flickered inside me, not for being vindicated, but for someone so young had found her voice in the middle of all that hypocrisy. She looked at me again, eyes filled with tears. "I came here today not because I want your forgiveness, but because I want your guidance. I don't want to become like them. I don't want Daniel and I to build a life on shame and appearances. I reached out, placing a hand gently over hers. Then don't. Build it on truth, on humility. You don't need to be perfect, Lauren, just honest. She nodded hesitantly. You're everything I want to be one day. Strong, composed, but kind. I smiled softly. Strength isn't about power, sweetheart. It's about restraint, knowing when to walk away and when to stay silent. Last night, I stayed silent not because I was weak, but because I wanted them to hear the echo of their own words. Her eyes widened slightly. That's exactly what happened. After you left, there was this awful silence. My mother tried to justify everything, said she was just being honest. My father said you were probably exaggerating about your background. And Daniel, he just exploded. He told them who you really are, about your work, your companies, your charity projects, everything. We both laughed quietly, a shared moment of relief amid the heaviness. Then Lauren reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you, but it's a letter from my mother. She wanted me to bring it. She said she couldn't face you yet. I took it carefully, but didn't open it. Tell her I'll read it when I'm ready. Lauren nodded, understanding. The clock ticked gently in the background, and the morning light spilled across the room like a quiet blessing. She looked around, her gaze softening at the photos on the wall, Daniel as a child, me at charity events, snapshots of a life built on hard work and quiet dignity. You built all this on your own? I nodded. Every brick, every scar. Her lips parted slightly, admiration shining through. I hope one day I can be half the woman you are. You already can, I said, smiling. All it takes is courage, the courage to see people for who they are, not what they wear. We stood then, and she hugged me tightly, the kind of hug that dissolves distance. When she pulled away, her tears had left soft marks on my shoulder. I'll make things right, she promised, with Daniel, with them, and with myself. I know you will. Just remember, redemption isn't about changing who you are for others. It's about becoming who you were meant to be all along. As she left, I watched from the window. She paused at the gate, turned and waved. The sun broke through the clouds just then, bathing her in golden light, a symbolic kind of forgiveness. When the gate clicked shut, I finally opened the letter in my hand. Inside was a single sentence written in delicate cursive. I misjudged you, and in doing so, misjudged myself. I smiled faintly, folded the paper, and whispered to the empty room. At least she finally looked in the mirror. The world outside felt lighter somehow, not because everything had been fixed, but because, for the first time, the truth had been seen. And that was enough. 2 days after Lauren's visit, life had almost returned to normal. I went back to work, attended a few meetings, and spent the evenings cooking quietly by the window, watching the city lights shimmer like distant memories. But underneath that calm routine, I could feel something brewing, a restlessness in the air, like the pause before thunder. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I had just finished watering my plants when the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp, impatient, not like Lauren's hesitant knock. I dried my hands and opened the door. Standing there, framed by the golden dusk, was a man I had hoped never to see again, Mr. Whitmore, Lauren's father. He looked every bit the part of the man who thought the world owed him reverence. A tailored navy suit, cufflinks glinting, a heavy gold watch, and a cologne that smelled like boardroom dominance. But today the arrogance in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something more human, discomfort. Mrs. Miller, he greeted stiffly, may I come in? I stepped aside silently, gesturing toward the sitting room. He entered, glancing around as if trying to reconcile the warmth of my modest home with whatever image he had built of me. The ticking clock, the soft scent of jasmine tea, the faint classical music from the background. None of it fit the narrative he had written in his mind. I poured him tea anyway, out of courtesy. He accepted it, though his hand trembled slightly as he set the cup down. He began, "I'll be direct. I came to apologize for that dinner, for the things my wife said, for the way I behaved." His words felt rehearsed, like lines from a speech drafted by guilt and polished by ego. I looked at him calmly. "You didn't come here for me, Mr. Whitmore. You came here for yourself, to ease your conscience." His jaw tightened. "That may be true, but I owe you an explanation." I leaned back slightly. "Then by all means, explain." He sighed deeply, the sound carrying years of entitlement unraveling. "I misjudged you. When Marcus said you lived modestly, I assumed you were ordinary. I thought you weren't good enough for our daughter's world, and I didn't want her to be burdened by your simplicity." I let a small smile cross my lips. "Simplicity isn't a burden, Mr. Whitmore. Pretension is." He flinched, but didn't respond. The silence stretched, heavy, but necessary. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "After that night, Daniel told us everything about your position at the company, your career, your philanthropy. He said you've been earning $40,000 a month for over a decade." I nodded slightly. "Yes, that's true." He swallowed hard. "I felt humiliated, not because of your success, but because of what it revealed about me, that I measured worth in the shallowest way possible." For a moment, I saw the man not as an enemy, but as a reflection, someone who had built walls of wealth to hide his own insecurities. He went on, voice trembling slightly. "I've spent my life teaching my daughter that success is about power, about never looking small. But last week, she told me she'd rather be good than powerful. She said she learned that from you." That caught me off guard. I looked away, blinking slowly. "She's a smart woman. She just needed to see what truly matters." He nodded, eyes downcast. "I suppose I needed to see it too." Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. Thick, white, sealed with embossed initials. He slid it across the table toward me. "What's this?" I asked. "An offer. Our firm has been looking for a new ethics advisor, someone who can help restructure our leadership culture. Lauren suggested your name. I know you don't need the money, but perhaps it's a way to make amends." I looked at the envelope without touching it. "You think hiring me will wash away your guilt?" He hesitated. "No. I think working with you might teach us something about humility." For the first time since he'd arrived, his tone wasn't defensive. It was vulnerable, the kind of vulnerability that costs a proud man dearly. I studied him for a long moment, then said softly, "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, when you first saw me at that restaurant, what did you feel?" He looked startled. "Honestly?" "Yes, honestly." He sighed. "Honestly, I felt embarrassed. I thought my daughter had married beneath her. I looked at you and saw everything I feared: struggle, simplicity, mediocrity. But when I saw how you handled that humiliation, how calm you were, I realized something. The room was full of wealthy people, yet you were the only one who looked truly rich." I let his words hang there, letting him sit in the weight of them. Then I stood slowly and walked toward my bookshelf. From the top shelf, I pulled a framed photo, one from years ago of me standing beside world leaders at a charity summit. I handed it to him. "You see this? I said. That day, I was offered a promotion that would have doubled my income. I turned it down because leadership isn't about climbing higher. It's about lifting others, something your company still hasn't learned. He looked at the photo in silence, his lips pressed tight. I'll think about your offer, I added, my tone even, but resolute, but not because I need to, because perhaps your daughter deserves to see that real change is possible. He nodded slowly, standing up. That's all I can ask. As he turned to leave, I said quietly, Mr. Whitmore, tell your wife I accept her apology, but tell her this. Next time she judges someone by their shoes, she should remember that the most powerful people in the world often walk quietly. He nodded once, eyes glistening with humility, and left without another word. When the door closed behind him, I exhaled deeply. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was peaceful, complete. I sat by the window, sipping the tea that had gone cold, watching the sun dip low across the skyline. There was no satisfaction in his remorse, only a gentle sense of balance being restored. For years, I had hidden who I was, not out of fear, but out of choice. And now, for the first time, I realized the power of that silence. Because silence, when rooted in truth, doesn't make you invisible. It makes you unshakable. Outside, the streetlights flickered to life one by one, like stars finding their place in the night. Somewhere deep inside, I felt a quiet warmth, the kind that comes not from revenge or victory, but from being seen for who you truly are. And for the first time in a long time, I whispered to myself, he finally met the real me. That evening, after Mr. Whitmore's visit, the city felt quieter than usual, as if the world itself had paused to listen. I was sitting near the window, the soft hum of the night wrapping around me, when I heard the familiar sound of my son's car pulling into the driveway. For a moment, I just sat there, frozen. It had been days since that disastrous dinner, and Daniel hadn't called or texted once. Part of me understood. Shame can silence even the strongest hearts. But another part of me ached. I missed him, my son, the little boy who once held my hand crossing the street, now a man torn between pride and regret. The doorbell rang. I rose slowly and opened it. There he was, Daniel, standing in the doorway, rain-damp hair falling across his forehead, his eyes heavy with the weight of unspoken words. In his hands, he held a grocery bag, the kind he used to bring home when we cooked together years ago. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. His voice cracked on the word Mom. I felt my throat tighten. "Come in, sweetheart." He stepped inside, placing the bag on the counter. I noticed the simple things: fresh vegetables, pasta, and a small carton of my favorite green tea. He hadn't come empty-handed. He had come the way he always used to, with care hidden in the smallest gestures. I thought maybe we could cook dinner together, like old times. My heart swelled. I'd like that. For a while, we moved around the kitchen in silence, chopping, stirring, pretending that nothing had happened. The clatter of utensils filled the air, but beneath it was something raw and real, the quiet rhythm of reconciliation trying to find its way home. Finally, as the pasta simmered, Daniel spoke. "Mom, I'm sorry." The words fell heavy, trembling, as though they'd been waiting too long to escape. He turned to face me, eyes shining. That night, when I introduced you to them, I wasn't thinking about you. I was thinking about me, about how they would see me if they saw you. I looked at him, my heart aching. You thought I'd embarrass you? He winced. Yes, and that thought has been eating me alive ever since. I leaned against the counter, saying nothing. He continued. When I saw you walk into that restaurant, wearing that plain gray dress, your hair pulled back, something inside me twisted. I saw how nervous you looked, and I hated myself because I wasn't proud. I was afraid of what they'd think. I let them talk down to you, and I didn't stop them. His voice broke then. I watched you smile while they insulted you, and I told myself to stay calm, that it wasn't worth the drama. But when you walked out that door, I realized I hadn't protected you. I'd betrayed you. I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me. For years, I had known that life would eventually teach him humility, but I never imagined it would come in such a painful lesson. I never wanted to hurt you, he whispered. You've done everything for me, and I treated you like a shameful secret. I stepped closer, placing my hand gently against his cheek. Daniel, do you know why I let it happen? He shook his head, tears brimming. I wanted you to see the world without my protection. I wanted you to understand that respect isn't inherited, it's earned. And I wanted them to see that power isn't loud or flashy. It's quiet. It's patient. It's me walking into that restaurant and letting their words tell the world who they are. He swallowed hard, guilt flickering in his eyes. When I told them about your real life, about what you've built, they were shocked. But it wasn't just them. I was shocked too. You hid so much from me, Mom. The success, the money, everything. Why? I smiled faintly. Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have. I didn't want my achievements to overshadow my motherhood. I wanted you to grow up into a man who respected kindness over wealth. He looked at me, tears spilling freely now. You did. You made me that man, eventually. Just took me a little too long to realize it. I laughed softly, brushing his tears with my bum. Better late than never. He pulled me into a hug then, a tight, desperate embrace that erased years of unspoken tension. I felt his shoulders shake, his breath ragged against my neck. I don't deserve you, he murmured. I whispered back, you're my son. That's all that matters. When we finally pulled apart, the air felt lighter, the kind of peace that comes when truth finally replaces pretense. We sat at the dinner table, eating quietly. Between bites, Daniel began to talk, really talk, about how embarrassed he'd been to grow up without the luxuries his friends had, about how he spent years trying to fit into a world that judged his origins, about how marrying Lauren had made him feel like he'd finally arrived, only to realize that love means nothing if it's built on image. And I listened, not as a critic, but as a mother. Every word he spoke was a thread sewing the torn edges between us. When the plates were empty, I stood and went to a drawer in the cabinet. I took out an old photo album, one Daniel hadn't seen in years. Inside were pictures from my early career. Me standing in boardrooms, shaking hands with executives, presenting at conferences. I placed it in front of him. "This," I said, "is the life I never showed you." Not because I wanted to hide my success, because I wanted to show you that real wealth isn't in photographs or salaries. It's in the values that survive after the spotlight fades. He turned the pages slowly, awe softening his expression. "You built all this alone?" "Yes, every bit of it. And I'd give it all away again if it meant keeping my integrity." He smiled through tears. "You're incredible." I chuckled softly. "No, I'm just a mother who learned the hard way that silence can teach louder than anger." The clock ticked quietly in the background. The rain outside had stopped, replaced by the distant hum of life continuing. As Daniel helped me clear the table, he said something that stayed with me forever. "Mom, from now on, I'll never hide who I come from. If anyone asks me about you, I'll tell them you're the strongest woman I've ever known." I paused, my hands trembling slightly as I placed a plate on the counter. "That's all I ever wanted, son. For you to see me, not the version you imagined, but the real me." He smiled. "I do now." And for the first time in years, when I looked at my son, I didn't see a boy trying to prove himself. I saw a man, grounded, humbled, and awake. The world outside glittered softly, and as we sat together under that warm light, I realized something profound. Love doesn't always need words. Sometimes
2 weeks passed, and the world felt gentler somehow. Daniel visited more often, Lauren called almost every day, and even the silences between us had softened into something peaceful. Life had found its rhythm again. Simple, honest, unpretentious. Then one evening, Lauren called with a tremor of excitement in her voice. "Mom," she said, "we'd like to invite you to dinner again. My parents will be there too. But this time, I promise, it won't be like before." I hesitated. The memory of that night still lived somewhere deep inside me. The sting of their judgment, the weight of my son's silence. But I also knew that growth means facing the same fire that once burned you, only this time walking through it without fear. So, I said yes. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday, at the same restaurant, the very same table by the window where humiliation once sat beside me. This time, though, I wouldn't be walking in as the simple, broke mother they pitied. I would walk in as myself, not to impress, but to remind them what dignity truly looks like when it finally takes its rightful place. That Saturday, I stood before my mirror again. The reflection that stared back wasn't the woman in the wrinkled gray dress anymore. She was gone, shed like an old skin. Instead, I wore a navy blue silk gown, simple but commanding, paired with a string of pearls my late husband had given me before Daniel was born. My hair was swept into a neat bun, my makeup subtle but elegant.
I didn't need to flaunt wealth. I was wealth, in presence, in calm, in truth. Before leaving, I slipped on a gold bracelet, not for luxury, but as a quiet symbol of strength reclaimed. When I arrived at the restaurant, the valet opened the door of my car, a sleek black sedan from my company's fleet. As I stepped out, the evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely free. Inside, the same warm lights flickered, and the same waiter greeted me, though this time recognition flickered in his eyes. "Good evening, Mrs. Miller," he said, smiling respectfully. "Your table is ready." As I approached the private dining area, I could already see them waiting. Daniel and Lauren, sitting side by side, both smiling nervously. Across from them sat Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, dressed impeccably as always, but visibly uneasy. When they saw me, there was a brief, stunned silence. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly, as if she were seeing a ghost. Mr. Whitmore stood immediately, his hand over his chest. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his tone full of hesitant reverence, "it's good to see you again." I smiled softly. It's good to be seen, properly, this time. Lauren rushed up to hug me. "You look stunning," she whispered. "Thank you, Beer. You both look happy. That's all that matters to me." We all sat. The waiter brought water, and for a few moments there was polite small talk, the kind that fills the air when people are trying to rebuild broken bridges. Mrs. Whitmore finally broke the silence. She said, "I owe you an apology," her voice shaking slightly. "What I said that night, there's no excuse for it. I was judgmental and cruel and wrong. I see that now." I studied her carefully, her posture, her tone, her eyes. For the first time, there was no pretense, no performance, just remorse. "I accept your apology," I said gently. "But let's not pretend it was easy to give or easy to receive. Change rarely is." She nodded, her chin trembling slightly. "I just hope you can forgive me." "I already have," I said. "The moment I walked out that night, I let it go. You see, forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from carrying someone else's mistake." Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Lauren told us you agreed to work with our company. I wanted to thank you for that. The team is excited, and I truly believe your perspective will help us rebuild the right way." I smiled faintly. "Let's hope so. Sometimes an empire needs to crumble before it can be rebuilt with integrity." He nodded solemnly. "You're right." As the evening continued, the air grew lighter. Daniel relaxed, laughing softly at something Lauren said. I watched him, my son, and felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with success or redemption, but everything to do with growth. Halfway through dinner, the waiter brought a bottle of wine and placed it beside me. "Compliments of the management, Mrs. Miller," he said. "They said it's an honor to have you here again." The table went silent for a moment. Even Mrs. Whitmore looked humbled. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. 2 weeks ago, I was invisible in this very place. Tonight, I was being honored. I raised my glass slightly. "To new beginnings," I said. "To new beginnings," they echoed. Then, as the meal went on, Mrs. Whitmore did something unexpected. She turned to Lauren and said softly, "I think your mother-in-law is the kind of woman I wish I'd been brave enough to be. Lauren reached for her mother's hand. It's never too late, Mom. For a fleeting second, the coldness in her face melted, replaced with something warmer, gentler. And in that fragile moment, I saw what redemption truly looks like. Not a grand apology, but a quiet shift in how someone chooses to see the world. When dessert arrived, Daniel turned to me, smiling. He said, Mom, thank you for giving everyone a second chance. Even me. I touched his hand. That's what love is, Daniel. Giving people the space to grow, even when it hurts. Mrs. Whitmore looked up then, her voice barely above a whisper. You taught us that. I smiled. No, life did. I just chose to listen. The conversation that followed was full of laughter and light. Cautious at first, then genuine. It wasn't about status or reputation anymore. It was about shared humanity. When the dinner finally ended, Mr. Whitmore stood and pulled out my chair. A small gesture, but one heavy with meaning. Outside, the night air was cool and still. The city glowed softly behind us, and for the first time, we all walked side by side. Equals. At the door, Mrs. Whitmore turned to me. Thank you, she said again, for your patience, your grace, and your strength. You changed the way I see people. I smiled, meeting her gaze. Then maybe my little experiment was worth it after all. Daniel laughed, realizing the irony. You mean pretending to be poor? I nodded. Yes, because sometimes people need to see what's beneath the surface before they can appreciate what's real. As they drove away, I stood under the restaurant's golden lights, feeling the gentle weight of closure settle over me. The woman who had walked into that place weeks ago had been underestimated, dismissed, judged. The woman walking out tonight was untouchable, not because of money, but because of truth. And the truth, once revealed, never needs defending again. When I returned home that night, the city was already sleeping. The streets shimmered under pools of lamplight, and the hum of distant traffic sounded like the world breathing. I parked the car, stepped out, and for a long moment just stood there, gazing up at the same moon that had watched over me through every storm, every heartbreak, every lesson. My house, small but full of memories, welcomed me with its familiar silence. I walked inside, kicked off my heels, and sat by the window with a cup of tea, just as I used to when Daniel was little. Back then, I'd sit there waiting for him to come home from school, the curtains fluttering in the wind, my heart full of dreams for the boy I was raising. Now, all these years later, I found myself waiting again, but this time, not for him to come home. I was waiting for peace to finally settle. And when it did, it came quietly, like a warm blanket wrapping around me. I looked around at the life I had built. Simple, honest, earned. Every object in that house had a story. Every scar, every wrinkle, every gray strand of hair was proof of endurance. For years, I had been afraid that people like the Whitmores, with their money and arrogance, could strip me of my dignity. But now I realize something far more powerful. Dignity isn't something people can take from you. It's something only you can give away. And I had refused to give mine away. Even when they mocked me, underestimated me, and treated me like I was invisible. I thought of that night, the first dinner, the way Lauren had looked at me with hidden embarrassment, the way Mrs. Whitmore had spoken to me like I was beneath her. And then I thought of tonight, the same faces, but softer, humbler, changed. It amazed me how a little truth, once revealed, could shift an entire world on its axis. I smiled, remembering Daniel's words. Thank you for giving everyone a second chance, even me. My son had grown up, not into the man I feared he'd become, but into someone capable of introspection and remorse. And that, I realized, was the real victory. It wasn't about exposing anyone or proving a point. It was about helping the people I loved see themselves clearly, and seeing myself clearly too. I set my teacup down and took a deep breath. Somewhere, deep inside, a weight lifted, one I hadn't even known I was carrying. For so long, I had defined my worth by the eyes that looked down on me. I had mistaken their approval for value. But now I finally understood. Worth is silent. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists. I opened my phone and scrolled through a few messages. Lauren had sent a photo from dinner, all of us smiling, glasses raised mid-toast. Underneath, she'd written, "You changed everything, Mom. Thank you for believing in love over pride." I stared at that message for a long time, my throat tightening with emotion. Then, almost instinctively, I whispered a prayer, not for revenge or justice, but for gratitude. I said to myself, thank you, God, for the storm that revealed who I am. I stood up and walked through the quiet house, touching the family pictures on the wall. One of Daniel as a child, missing front teeth, holding up his first report card. One of me and my late husband standing in front of the old house we'd built together. And one of us as a family, smiling despite the worn-out clothes and cracked frames. We didn't have much, but what we had was real. And maybe that's what this entire journey had been about, stripping away everything fake, every illusion of status, every performance of perfection, until all that was left was truth. I went out to the garden, the same one I'd spent hours tending during the hard years. The night air was cool, the scent of jasmine lingering. I sat on the old wooden bench and watched as the wind swayed the flowers gently, like the earth itself was exhaling peace. And then a memory surfaced. The look on Mrs. Whitmore's face when she said, "You taught us that." No, I hadn't taught them. Life had. But maybe I'd been the mirror that life needed to hold up. Maybe that's why fate had placed me in their path. Maybe that's why I'd chosen to walk the painful road of pretense, to reveal something no amount of wealth could buy. Character. As I sat there, I thought of all the women like me, mothers who had been underestimated, dismissed, made to feel small in rooms they built the foundations for. Women who worked silently, sacrificed endlessly, and yet were seen as less. This story, I realized, wasn't just mine. It was theirs too. It was the story of every mother who had swallowed pride to protect love. Every woman who had learned that silence can be louder than words. Every soul who had been looked down on and still chose grace over bitterness. Because in the end, grace is the most exquisite revenge. I smiled at the stars above, so many of them, scattered like secrets across the sky. Somewhere out there, I hoped Mrs. Whitmore was also looking up, reflecting, changing. And maybe Daniel too, sleeping peacefully, proud of the woman who raised him. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. Not because they finally saw my worth, but because I no longer needed them to. As the clock struck midnight, I whispered the last words of my story to the night. I pretended to be poor to see their true colors, but in the end, I found mine. And with that, I closed my eyes, letting the silence fill the room. A silence that didn't ache anymore, but healed. Because sometimes pretending to be less isn't about testing others. It's about rediscovering the strength you always had. And when the world finally sees you for who you are, you don't rise above them with pride. You simply walk away with dignity.